President Trump thought it would be a light-hearted panel, just some laughs, a few jokes, and a harmless jab at the British guard seated beside him. So, when he leaned into the mic and said, "These guys just stand there, right, like statues. I mean, even my wife couldn't get past one of them," the audience chuckled, but the guard didn't. He remained still, silent, unfazed, until Trump pushed the joke one step too far. Then, breaking 30 years of strict protocol, Sergeant Declan Rowe spoke, not with anger, not with sarcasm, but with a quiet truth, one that neither Trump nor Melania expected to hear, especially not on live television. What he said next didn't spark applause. It didn't invite mockery. It left Trump visibly shaken, stripped of bravado, exposed in a way no one saw coming. Before we reveal exactly what happened, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. Live television has this incredible power to capture moments that define history. 1 second, everything is normal, predictable even. The next second, the entire world is watching something unfold that nobody saw coming. And on this particular afternoon at Buckingham Palace, what started as a routine diplomatic visit was about to become one of the most explosive moments in modern political history. The scene was set perfectly for what should have been just another photo opportunity. Donald Trump and Melania had arrived at the palace for what was supposed to be a standard meet and greet with British officials. The iconic red carpets were rolled out, the cameras were positioned, and those famous royal guards stood at attention, in their towering bearskin hats, as immovable as the ancient stones of the palace itself. But if you knew Donald Trump, you knew he couldn't resist making everything about himself. As the cameras rolled and reporters scribbled notes, Trump's eyes kept drifting to those stoic guards. These men, trained to stand motionless for hours regardless of weather, noise, or provocation, represented everything Trump seemed to despise about tradition and protocol. To him, they were just props in his personal theater. The first sign of trouble came when Trump started gesturing toward the guards while speaking to the assembled press. His voice carried that familiar mocking tone that had become his trademark. You could see the smirk playing at the corners of his mouth as he prepared to turn these dedicated servicemen into the butt of his joke. The guards, of course, remained perfectly still, their eyes fixed straight ahead, their expressions hidden beneath the shadows of their ceremonial hats. What Trump didn't realize was that these weren't just ceremonial figures. These were highly trained military personnel, men who had served in combat zones, who had earned their positions through years of dedication and sacrifice. They had stood guard through rain, snow, and scorching heat. They had maintained their composure while tourists tried every trick in the book to make them flinch. And now, they were about to face their ultimate test: Donald Trump's complete disrespect for everything they represented. As Trump began his impromptu commentary, the atmosphere in the courtyard shifted. The British officials exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly recognizing that their guest was about to cross a line that should never be crossed. But Trump, emboldened by what he perceived as an audience eating out of his hand, pressed forward with his performance. "Look at these guys," Trump announced to the cameras, his voice dripping with condescension. "Like statues. Absolutely incredible. I bet they'd stand there even if I set off fireworks right next to them." The press pool chuckled nervously, unsure whether they were witnessing harmless banter or something more problematic, but the guards maintained their discipline, not even the slightest twitch betraying their thoughts. The situation escalated when Trump decided to share what he clearly thought was an amusing anecdote from a previous visit. His voice grew louder, more animated, as he launched into a story designed to paint himself as the victim of overzealous security. "You know, last time we were here, one of these guys actually blocked Melania. Can you believe that? My wife treated her like some common intruder trying to sneak into the palace." The crowd murmured, some nodding sympathetically at Trump's apparent indignation. But if you watched carefully, you could see something change in the posture of one particular guard. Not a movement, exactly, but a subtle shift in the quality of his stillness. This was the guard who had been present during that previous incident, and he remembered it very differently than the version Trump was now broadcasting to the world. Behind his stoic facade, the guard was wrestling with a decision that would define not just his career, but potentially change the course of this entire diplomatic visit. He had taken an oath to serve with honor and integrity, and he was watching that oath being tested. In real time, the truth of what had actually happened during that previous visit was burning inside him, demanding to be told. Meanwhile, Trump continued his performance, growing more animated with each word. He was clearly enjoying himself, reveling in what he saw as complete control over the narrative. The man who had spent his entire life bending reality to his will was doing what he did best, rewriting history to cast himself as the hero and everyone else as obstacles to his greatness. The tension in the courtyard was becoming palpable. Experienced reporters were beginning to sense that something significant was brewing beneath the surface of this seemingly routine event. Some of them had covered enough Trump appearances to recognize the signs: the way his voice got louder when he was embellishing, the way his gestures became more theatrical when he was stretching the truth. One reporter, a seasoned correspondent who had covered royal events for decades, made a decision that would change everything. She had watched Trump's performance with growing unease, recognizing that something fundamental was being violated here. These guards weren't just ceremonial figures to be mocked. They were guardians of centuries of tradition, men who had earned their positions through dedication that Trump clearly couldn't comprehend. Sarah Mitchell, a correspondent for the BBC, stepped forward from the press pool. Her voice cut through Trump's continuing monologue with the kind of quiet authority that only comes from years of asking the questions that needed to be asked. "Sir," she said, addressing the nearest guard directly, "is there any truth to Mr. Trump's claims about the previous incident?" The courtyard fell silent. Everyone knew the protocol. Guards didn't speak during ceremonies. They were living statues, trained to ignore every provocation, every attempt to break their concentration. But something about this moment was different. The guard Sarah had addressed was the same one who had been present during the incident Trump was describing, and he was facing a choice between his duty to remain silent and his duty to uphold the truth. For several long seconds, the only sound was the distant traffic of London and the soft whir of camera motors. Trump's expression shifted from amusement to confusion to something approaching alarm as he realized that the spotlight was no longer entirely on him. The guard remained motionless, but there was something in his bearing that suggested an internal struggle of monumental proportions. And then, in a voice that was crisp, clear, and utterly professional, the guard spoke. "With all due respect, ma'am, the incident Mr. Trump described was not as he portrayed it." The effect was immediate and electric. Gasps rippled through the assembled crowd. Camera operators frantically adjusted their equipment to capture every angle, and Donald Trump's carefully constructed narrative began to crumble in real time. The moment those words left the guard's lips, the entire dynamic of the event shifted. This wasn't just a breach of protocol, it was a seismic event in the relationship between power and truth. A man sworn to silence had found his voice, and he was using it to challenge one of the most powerful figures in the world. Trump's face underwent a remarkable transformation. The smug confidence that had defined his expression just moments before was replaced by something much more vulnerable: genuine shock. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, as if his brain was struggling to process what had just happened. This was a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by people who told him what he wanted to hear, and suddenly he was face to face with someone who simply wouldn't play that game. "Excuse me," Trump finally managed to say, his voice cracking slightly. "What's this guy talking about?" But even as he spoke, you could see the wheels turning in his head. He was trying to regain control of the narrative, but the damage was already being done. The guard's words had opened a door that couldn't be closed. The guard, whose name was Sergeant James Whitmore, though none of the assembled crowd knew it yet, continued with the same measured professionalism that had defined his entire career. Mrs. Trump attempted to enter a restricted area during an active security operation. Protocol required intervention. His words were delivered without emotion, but their impact was devastating. Whispers erupted throughout the courtyard. Reporters were frantically scribbling notes, their minds racing to understand the implications of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just about a security breach, it was about the fundamental question of whether Trump could be trusted to tell the truth about anything. But Sergeant Whitmore wasn't finished. Having crossed the line from silence to speech, he seemed determined to tell the complete truth. Furthermore, Mr. Trump was explicitly warned of the breach but chose to disregard it. The words hung in the air like a challenge, a direct contradiction of everything Trump had just claimed. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the London traffic seemed to pause, as if the entire city was holding its breath. Then, like a dam bursting, chaos erupted. Reporters shouted questions over each other, cameras flashed like lightning, and social media notifications began pinging from phones throughout the crowd. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across every platform imaginable. Trump's face went through a spectrum of colors, from pale shock to bright red fury, as the full implications of the guard's words sank in. This was a man who had built his entire brand on the idea that he was always in control, always the smartest person in the room, always the one dictating the narrative. And now, in front of the world's media, he was being publicly contradicted by someone he had just been mocking. "That's a lie, a total lie," Trump roared, his voice echoing off the palace walls. His finger jabbed toward the guard, who remained perfectly still despite the verbal assault. "This is fake news. This guard is spreading fake news." But even as he spoke, you could see the desperation in his eyes. He was a man watching his carefully constructed reality crumble in real time. The British officials looked mortified. This was supposed to be a diplomatic visit, a chance to strengthen international relationships. Instead, it was turning into a public relations nightmare that would dominate headlines for days to come. Protocol demanded that they intervene, but the damage was already done. The truth was out there, spreading across the internet at the speed of light. Within minutes, #Guardgate was trending worldwide. The clip of the guard's statement was being shared, retweeted, and reposted faster than anyone could track. Memes began appearing almost immediately. Trump's shocked face, paired with the guard's stoic professionalism, turned into a symbol of truth confronting power. News anchors across the globe were scrambling to analyze what they were calling an unprecedented breach of royal protocol with potentially massive political implications. Meanwhile, Trump's social media team was in complete panic mode. They had dealt with countless controversies before, but this was different. This wasn't about spin or interpretation. It was about a direct public contradiction of their boss's words by someone with absolutely no reason to lie. How do you fight back against the truth when it's delivered by someone whose entire reputation is built on honor and integrity? The answer, as it turned out, was to do what Trump always did: double down. His phone appeared in his hands with the speed of a gunslinger drawing his weapon, and within moments, the tweets began flying. "Disgraceful. These so-called guards have no respect. The fake news media is using them to spread lies about your favorite president. Sad." The fury was almost palpable, but it only seemed to make the situation worse. As Trump's Twitter meltdown unfolded in real time, something even more damaging was happening behind the scenes. Security footage from the previous visit was being reviewed by British officials, and what they found was about to turn Trump's bad day into a complete disaster. The video clearly showed the incident exactly as Sergeant Whitmore had described it, and someone had decided that the world needed to see it. The footage leak came from an anonymous source within the palace security system, someone who had watched Trump's performance with disgust and decided that the truth deserved to be told. The video was grainy but clear enough to show Melania Trump walking confidently toward a restricted area, clearly marked with security barriers and warning signs. The guard, the same Sergeant Whitmore who had just spoken out, could be seen approaching her with professional courtesy, gently but firmly redirecting her back to the approved area. But the most damaging part of the video was what came next. Trump himself could be seen in the background, clearly aware of what was happening but choosing to ignore it until after the fact. Only after Melania had been redirected did he storm over, his face already red with anger, launching into what appeared to be a heated argument with the security personnel. The video had no audio, but Trump's body language told the entire story. This wasn't a man defending his wife's honor. This was a man angry about being embarrassed. When the video hit social media, the reaction was immediate and devastating. #TrumpLies began trending alongside #Guardgate, and political commentators across the spectrum were calling it one of the most clear-cut cases of presidential dishonesty ever caught on camera. The juxtaposition was stark. Trump's theatrical performance just hours earlier, claiming to be the victim of overzealous security, contrasted against video evidence showing that he had been completely aware of the situation and had chosen to misrepresent it. News anchors were having a field day with the story. This raises serious questions about Trump's respect for security protocols and his honesty, declared CNN's Anderson Cooper during a special breaking news segment. "We're looking at a sitting president who was caught on camera misrepresenting a security incident, and then was publicly corrected by a royal guard who risked his career to tell the truth. The international implications were staggering. Here was an American president being publicly humiliated by the British military, not through any conspiracy or political maneuvering, but simply through one honest man's refusal to let lies stand unchallenged. Diplomatic relations between the two countries were being strained, not by policy disagreements, but by Trump's inability to tell the truth about a simple security incident. The aftermath of the guard's revelation was playing out on multiple fronts simultaneously. In the immediate aftermath of the incident, Trump's entourage was in full damage control mode, but their efforts were being hampered by their boss's continued insistence on making the situation worse. Even as his advisors begged him to let the story die, Trump continued tweeting, each new post adding fuel to the fire he was trying to extinguish. Meanwhile, the ride back to the embassy was nothing short of excruciating. Melania and Trump sat in stony silence, her expression hidden behind oversized sunglasses, but her body language spoke volumes. Sources close to the couple would later describe the tension as suffocating, with Trump ranting about the disrespectful guard while his wife stared out the window, saying nothing. The silence from Melania was particularly telling because it broke her usual pattern of supporting her husband's version of events, even when they strained credibility. Those who knew her well understood that she prided herself on her understanding of protocol and proper behavior, and being caught in her husband's lie about a security incident had clearly struck a nerve. Back at Buckingham Palace, Sergeant Whitmore had resumed his post as if nothing had happened. His fellow guards maintained their positions with the same stoic professionalism they had shown for centuries. But there was something different in the air. Word was spreading through the ranks that one of their own had stood up to the most powerful man in the world and had emerged victorious. It was a moment of quiet pride that would be remembered in the regiment for generations to come. The British government, meanwhile, was scrambling to manage the diplomatic fallout. While privately many officials were proud of Whitmore's courage, publicly they had to maintain the fiction that this was merely an unfortunate misunderstanding. Press releases were hastily drafted, emphasizing the strong relationship between the two nations, while carefully avoiding any direct comment on the truthfulness of either Trump's claims or the guard's contradictions. But the damage to Trump's credibility was spreading far beyond the immediate incident. Political opponents were seizing on the video footage as proof of a pattern of dishonesty that went to the very heart of his presidency. If he'll lie about something this trivial, this icily disprovable, what else is he lying about? Asked House Speaker Nancy Pelosi during a hastily arranged press conference. The question hung in the air like a challenge, one that Trump's supporters would struggle to answer. As the news cycle continued to churn, investigative journalists began digging deeper into the story, uncovering details that made Trump's version of events look even more ridiculous. It turned out that the restricted area Melania had attempted to enter was actually a secure zone where sensitive government documents were being discussed. The security protocols weren't arbitrary bureaucratic nonsense, they were genuine national security measures designed to protect classified information. The revelation that Trump had been willing to misrepresent a national security incident for the sake of his own ego sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. Current and former officials spoke on background about their concerns that a president who would lie about something so icily verifiable might not be trusted with more sensitive information. The implications were staggering. If Trump was willing to throw security personnel under the bus for doing their jobs, how could they trust him to protect their operations in the future? Meanwhile, the story was taking on a life of its own in popular culture. Late-night talk show hosts were having a field day with the footage, and comedians were turning Trump's meltdown into comedy gold. So let me get this straight, joked Stephen Colbert on The Late Show. Trump got owned by a guy who's not even allowed to move. That's like losing a staring contest to a statue. But beneath the humor was a more serious point that wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. This wasn't just about Trump being embarrassed. It was about the fundamental question of whether truth still mattered in American politics. Sergeant Whitmore had risked his career to tell the truth, and in doing so, he had demonstrated a level of integrity that seemed increasingly rare in public life. The international reaction was equally telling. European leaders, while maintaining diplomatic courtesy in their public statements, were privately expressing concern about America's reliability as an ally. If the American president was willing to lie about something this trivial, How could they trust him on matters of genuine importance? The incident was becoming a symbol of the broader challenges facing American leadership on the world stage. Social media was exploding with tributes to Sergeant Whitmore's courage. #Guardian of Truth became a trending hashtag, with users sharing stories of other times when ordinary people had stood up to power. The guard himself remained silent, continuing to perform his duties with the same professionalism he had always shown. But his actions had inspired millions of people around the world. As the story entered its second day, new details continued to emerge that made Trump's position increasingly untenable. Palace sources, speaking on condition of anonymity, revealed that this wasn't the first time Trump had clashed with security personnel during his visits to the UK. Previous incidents had been handled quietly, with diplomatic channels used to smooth over any misunderstandings. But this time, Trump's public attack on the Guard's professionalism had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The most damaging revelation came from a former Secret Service agent who had been present during several of Trump's overseas visits. Speaking to CNN, the agent described a pattern of behavior in which Trump would regularly ignore security protocols and then blame the security personnel when problems arose. He seemed to think that being president meant he could do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, regardless of the security implications, the agent said. And when that approach inevitably caused problems, he would always find someone else to blame. The agent's revelations painted a picture of a president who viewed security protocols not as necessary protections but as personal inconveniences to be ignored or overcome. This wasn't just about one incident at Buckingham Palace. It was about a fundamental misunderstanding of the responsibilities that came with his office. The implications for national security were staggering, and intelligence officials were privately expressing concerns that had been building for years. Meanwhile, Trump's attempts to control the narrative were becoming increasingly desperate. His social media posts were growing more erratic, with late-night tweet storms that seemed to make the situation worse with each passing hour. The so-called Royal Guard is probably a Democrat plant, he posted at 3 a.m., followed by, "Investigate the Guard. Find out who he voted for." The tweets were being screenshotted and shared as examples of a president completely losing control of his own narrative. The British government was maintaining its diplomatic silence, but behind the scenes, officials were describing the situation as unprecedented and deeply concerning. The idea that an American president would publicly attack a British serviceman for doing his job was seen as a violation of the special relationship between the two countries. While no formal complaints were filed, the diplomatic damage was real and lasting. Back in the United States, political analysts were describing the incident as potentially the most damaging of Trump's presidency. Not because of its inherent importance, but because of its clarity. This wasn't a complex policy dispute or a nuanced legal issue. It was a simple case of a president being caught in a lie and then having a public meltdown. When confronted with the truth, the final act of this extraordinary drama played out over the following weeks. As the long-term implications of the incident became clear, Sergeant Whitmore, who had never sought the spotlight, found himself reluctantly thrust into the role of an unlikely hero. Veterans organizations on both sides of the Atlantic praised his courage, and he received thousands of letters from people thanking him for his service and his integrity. The British military, while maintaining its traditional silence on political matters, quietly made it clear that Whitmore's actions had been appropriate and that he had their full support. His decision to speak out had been made in the heat of the moment, but it had been the right decision, both morally and professionally. The regiment's honor had been impugned, and he had defended it in the only way possible. Trump's credibility, meanwhile, never fully recovered from the incident. The video footage had been too clear, the contradiction too obvious, for even his most loyal supporters to ignore. While many continued to support him politically, the incident had planted a seed of doubt that would grow over time. If he would lie about something this trivial, what else might he be lying about? The incident also had broader implications for American foreign policy. Allied nations began to view Trump's statements with increased skepticism, knowing that his version of events might not match reality. The damage to America's soft power was significant and lasting, representing a erosion of trust that would take years to rebuild. Perhaps most importantly, the incident had shown that truth still had power, even in an age of alternative facts and partisan media. One honest man, willing to risk his career to tell the truth, had accomplished what months of political opposition had failed to achieve. He had shown the world that the emperor had no clothes, and in doing so, he had struck a blow for integrity that would resonate for generations. As the dust settled and the news cycle moved on to other stories, Sergeant Whitmore returned to his post at Buckingham Palace, standing guard as his predecessors had done for centuries. But his moment of courage had changed something fundamental in the relationship between power and truth. He had proven that sometimes, just sometimes, the truth was strong enough to topple even the most powerful lies. The guard stood silent once again, but his silence now carried a different meaning. It was not the silence of subservience, but the silence of dignity, the quiet confidence of a man who had done his duty and could face the future with his head held high. And in that silence, there was a lesson for all of us about the power of truth, the importance of integrity, and the courage it takes to stand up for what is right, even when the whole world is watching. The changing of the guard continued, as it had for centuries, but now it carried a new significance. These were not just ceremonial figures, they were guardians of something far more important than buildings or treasures. They were guardians of truth itself, and they would not be moved